welcome. It's September the 18th, 2022. I'm with Pannobhasa in South Carolina and Ajahn Punnadhammo in Northern Ontario. We're going to talk about Buddhism versus atheism. So who'd like to go first?
I think the Ajahn proposed this one, so I guess according to our unofficial rules, he gets to start.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot who proposed it. Okay, atheism, there's a problem.
Yeah, well, first point to make is that Buddhism is not atheistic, nor is it really theistic. If you have to put a label on it, I would say it's non-theistic, because atheism is associated with a materialist worldview, and Buddhism is definitely not materialist or mechanistic materialism. It's one of the false views of Theravada. So although it's not, it's also not theistic, and it doesn't have a creator God, in its system. There is a passage written by Maurice Walsh in an essay that he uses an analogy that I think it always struck me as being very clever. He said, there's an optical illusion. If you have a round body of water, a lake, say a moderate sized lake, and there's an island dead center in the middle of the lake, from either shore, it will appear to be close to the far shore. And he says that Buddhism as the middle path between theism and atheism is like that the atheists standing on their shore, they look at Buddhism and they say, well, it's just another religion. It's full of the same superstitious claptrap as everything else. You walk around the lake and stand there with the theists, Christians or whatever, and they look at the island and say, well, Buddhism it's not that different from atheism or nihilism. It doesn't believe in God. It doesn't believe in an immortal soul. So they lump it in with the materialists or the nihilists. But it's actually the middle path between the two.
Yeah, sometimes in discussions of religion, Theravada or just Buddhism in general will be brought up as a case that a religion doesn't necessarily have to worship God. And then they will say that in that sense that something like Theravada is atheistic. But I mean, the main thing about Theravada, it does accept the world or the conventional existence of small g gods, like a polytheistic small g gods, but they don't really have any power to save us or damn us. That's our own doing, and theirs is their own doing. And so it's sort of like the Epicureans in ancient, like classical times, who believed that there were gods, but the gods really didn't care much about us any more than we care about ants in a vacant lot. So yeah, I mean, you could kind of argue that Theravada is sort of atheistic, although if you go with the idea that like modern atheism is just, I mean, it's essentially scientific materialism, just raised to the level of just an atheistic religion, essentially. Where, I mean, they tend to be very smug, like the atheists on YouTube, they tend to be very smug, they just are absolutely sure that they're right, that science is just other cultures in the past may have been ignorant and superstitious, but now because we got science, we've got it figured out. There's just a few gaps we haven't figured out yet, but just the whole structure we've got figured out, and then there's just these little gaps we have to fill in. But somebody like Rupert Sheldrake can point out that really they're just guessing on the fundamentals, and all it's going to take is just one experiment, like the Michelson-Morley experiment, that's just going to turn everything upside down again. Another Einstein come along with relativity or whatever, and everything just gets turned upside down all over again.
Well, the big gap in materialist thinking is consciousness. They cannot explain consciousness.
Yeah, there was a commentator when we were talking about materialism that was really just I mean, he didn't seem to understand that, I mean, really, science cannot explain how electrochemical reactions in nervous tissue can possibly result in the experience, the subjective experience of consciousness. You know, they
Yeah.
just take it for granted as, you know, it's some sort of side effect of electrochemical reactions, but they can't even not even begin to explain
No,
how it happens, you know, how it could possibly happen.
no, they, and you see the language that they use that, it's like well, we can't explain, we don't know exactly how it happens, but it must arise in the brain through chemical reactions.
Yeah. And I
As-
mean, they do have some evidence, kind of. I mean, it's like, you know, you damage a certain part of the brain and you're unable to do certain mental functions, that sort
Yeah,
of thing.
but you know, I like to think of the brain as more like a radio receiver than a computer. Like, if you take the analogy, you know, you're saying like if you damage part of the brain, then it affects your cognition. That's true. If you have a radio and you tune it, you're listening to music or talk radio, if you take the back off and start poking with the potentiometers and the wires, and you're going to change the sound, you're going to affect it. But the music or the talk doesn't originate in the radio.
Yeah.
It originates elsewhere, and it's just being expressed by the radio.
Yeah, or even the idea of a computer. I kind of like the idea that if you compare consciousness to the electricity, and, you know, perceptions and so forth would be more like just how the electricity is manipulated and so forth, then a computer doesn't create electricity. It's just organizing it and complexifying it and utilizing it. But then, I mean, still you'd have the problem of how perceptions could exist without a brain. And there does seem to be some evidence for perception existing without a brain. Yeah, it's a very strange system, and it may be that we're sort of like frogs trying to understand ultimate reality intellectually, when, you know, it's like we look at a frog and, you know, we can say, well, the frog just has the crudest possible understanding of its environment, but theoretically there could be beings as far above us as we are above frogs who could say the same thing about humans. You know, it's like they can't really understand their reality in anything but a very crude way.
Yeah.
Unless you just go with mysticism, where you just, you know, just where you stop thinking, and then you're not relying on the crudeness of the hardware.
I'll comment on atheism. I think of this as the nihilationists, materialist view that the Buddha criticized as a pernicious wrong view. The problem with this is actions and their effects after death. If you're an atheist and you're annihilated from existence, then there's no consequences to your actions. That's why I think of this as a pernicious wrong view. You think of Lenin and Trotsky, they were communists, so communism is atheistic. So to them, you know, they're atheists. There's no effects to them personally of their actions after they kill like 20 million people in their own country in the Soviet Union. If they're atheists, if they really believe that and think that way, well, they're not concerned about any results of their actions after they kill 20 million people. So if you really believe in cause and effect and don't have that atheistic view, that it might affect your moral behavior. Now, certainly, I know a lot of atheists that are still moral people, but it brings up an ethical question, the annihilationist materialist view. So I think that's the big problem with atheism. They deny the effects of moral actions after death.
Yeah, they had those in the Buddhist time too. It was one of the teachers, I can't remember which one he was, who said if you had like this razor sharp disc and you went up one bank of the Ganges, just cutting all living beings into a pile of bloody flesh, and then came back the other way, it wouldn't have any effect on you at all. It's just,
I remember that sutta. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's always been, you know, people that were just like materialists, like the Charvakas in ancient India or whatever, the scientific materialist atheists now, and the Marxists also. But yeah, the Buddha, I mean, according to the text, the Buddha did denounce that as really pernicious. But then again, like you were saying, there has to be an ethic that is not based on decrees by God. in order for Buddhism to work, and it does work. It's like some people argue without God, you've got no ethics. I
That
mean,
doesn't
that's
make sense.
that's a
right?
common argument.
Yeah,
Without a
does make
God
sense.
decreeing right and wrong, then there just is no right and wrong. Like Dostoevsky's, all is permitted. If there is no God, all is permitted. And in a way, all is permitted, even if there is a God, sort of. I mean, obviously, people are getting away with all kinds of things, but really, Buddhism its ethics is based on psychology. I mean, whatever brings you closer to enlightenment is wholesome and skillful, and whatever takes you farther away from it, whatever increases your contentment and fewness of desires and just overall happiness is going to be good and wholesome, and whatever decreases that and just makes your mind more cloudy and makes you have more attachments and desires is going to be unethical or immoral. And that's essentially how it works, as far as I can tell. It's just based on just laws of psychology, just the human nature in general, or just the nature of consciousness, samsaric consciousness in general. So there is sort of a fundamental ethical code that does not require God. And I'm sorry that people like Jordan Peterson, who are just striving desperately to find some empirical basis for morals, that he hasn't really studied Buddhism very much, because they've got it. It seems like it's very well worked out and understood.
There have been attempts to develop a atheistic Buddhism, or materialist Buddhism. We've seen that. Stephen Batchelor is a famous example, with the Buddhism Without Beliefs, and then the Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist. But that doesn't work ultimately, because what's missing ends up being the third noble truth. The nibbana, realization of the unconditioned escape from samsara, doesn't make any sense in a purely materialist view. If we're just machines made out of meat, and when we die we just rot, there's nothing further, what sense is there in striving for nibbana? What does it even mean?
Yeah, if when you're dead, and you do believe in the first noble truth, then just committing suicide would be the logical thing to do.
Yes, yeah, either that, or just throwing yourself into sensual indulgence to the max until that gets old, and then commit suicide.
How does Stephen Batchelor deal with that? How does he rationalize his way around that?
I don't know.
He hasn't killed himself yet.
No. But he's not the only one. There's been there's others that follow that kind of line, that try and reduce the Buddhist teachings to a form that would be amenable or palatable to a mechanistic materialist thinker.
Yeah, to Western atheists. Yeah, like in the Insight Meditation Society, they don't talk much about karma. They're really into their mindfulness.
Yeah. Which is kind of this, it seems like very short-sighted view that these people have, because the actual Western science and scientists, particularly in physics, are pushing that boundary so far that materialism is kind of outmoded. It's outdated.
Good point. Yeah.
Yeah, but like a lot of Buddhists in the West really are of the more or less leftist materialist tendency, and Buddhism is just kind of a psychological self-help system, and they stay away from any talk of rebirth or even enlightenment, because it's not scientifically verifiable.
Yes. Yeah, well, to me that's such a washed out version of Buddhism. It doesn't seem worth it.
Yeah, it's like mindfulness as stress relief or some such.
Yeah, where's the inspiration there? Yeah, it's like the Buddha came to this earth to teach a few stress reduction techniques. No inspiration. Not very motivating.
Yeah. Yeah, like I was telling you earlier before we started recording, there was an article written by a Buddhist scholar. You know, he's got a PhD in Buddhist studies, specializes in early Buddhism, who is saying that not only did the Buddha probably not exist, or I mean, there's no evidence for his existence, no real, persuasive evidence that Buddhism really didn't even, early Buddhism didn't teach meditation even. It was just based on a few, ethical principles and some primitive metaphysics and cosmology and so forth. And it's
Well, what's his
hardly any
name?
different.
We should give the audience his name.
David Drews, I think was his
Oh.
name.
David Drews.
Yeah. And there's just a lot of people that they just accept modern Western metaphysics as just the baseline. Like Richard Gombrich, he wrote a book called How Buddhism Began, the Conditioned Genesis of the Early Teachings. And in the introductory part, he says he's going to stay away from any metaphysical views. He's just going to be metaphysically neutral. And then throughout the rest of the book, he's just adopting, the liberal academic, scientific materialism approach, that he's so immersed in it that he doesn't even notice that he's adopting a metaphysical view. But everybody's got a metaphysical view.
Yes.
Even a chicken has got, naive realism as its metaphysical view just by default.
Yeah, that's a good point that you're making there. And I think it's not only the case of Gombrich, but I think a lot of people absorb that view, the materialist view, without being fully conscious that it's an accepted, it's an adopted view. It's just reality to them.
Yeah, it's cultural conditioning.
Yeah, our culture forces it
on us. They don't see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's part of our culture. Media pumps that at us, keep us away from spirituality.
Yeah, I do think that there is some of that in like Western Buddhism, where the left, political left, cultural left in particular, they tend towards some kind of socialism. Like, Marxism is like the main kind of socialism, and it's just anti-religion. It's just hardcore materialism.
Yeah.
And so they absorb a lot of that just through osmosis. And then they just don't like spirituality because it just kind of threatens their worldview or some such. And so they're just trying to demote like Dharma or Dhamma into just, like I was saying, just like a stress relief self-help system that's fits perfectly into Western psychology. And that's that.
There's a little book I read recently that had a couple of ideas in it that were new to me and really struck me. That you've probably heard of Dugin, Alexander Dugin, Russian philosopher.
Yeah.
He's an Orthodox Christian. Okay, so that's where he's coming from, and he traces the ideological mode or mood of the modern West back to the medieval debate between the nominalists and the realists, which I was aware of this debate from my reading of history, but I always thought it was something totally irrelevant to modern thought. It's just like medieval scholars in Europe debating about some obscure metaphysical thing. The names nominalist and realist are sort of opposite of what you might assume. The realist school traced a lot of their thought back to Plato, and they held that abstract concepts like love, duty, freedom, abstract concepts like that have a reality. And also, more importantly, for Dugin's point, collective concepts like the French, the Catholics, the nobility, right? That those are real categories. Whereas the nominalists held that all these things are just names and conventions, and there's no such thing as the nobility. There's just a bunch of individuals that you have this place in society individually. The collectivity doesn't really exist except as a convention. And in medieval times, in Europe, the realist school, the one that traced their idea to Plato and held that these groups were real, they won. In Thomas Aquinas was a realist, and
Oh,
that
that's too
ended up
bad.
they ended up being the dominant school. But then with the Protestant Reformation, it flipped, and the nominalists became the dominant school, and they kept over the centuries, they kept pushing the idea further and further without really internalizing, understanding their roots, but just the idea that the only reality is the individual. So now you have in modern times, he gives the example like a transgenderism, because man and woman are not real categories. There's only individuals everyone's on some kind of a spectrum. And the latest, or the furthest, it's just beginning, the furthest push of this thing is transhumanism, that even humanity is not real. That they're only individual organisms that we can class as human, but maybe you can take out half their brain and put in computer chips.
Yeah.
So this is where I'm getting with this is sort of roundabout from our theme, but it connects because we're talking about the modern cultural assumptions and underlying worldview, modern times, and modernism has got this really strong bias towards individualism, right? And Dugan traces it back to this nominalist view, which I thought was a really interesting insight. I hadn't ever looked at that before.
Yeah.
Well, I tend towards nominalism myself, although it does seem that if you're a human being, you're going to be thinking in a certain way. I don't believe that you're a blank slate when we're born. And so, I mean, we are kind of locked into the human nature, the human condition. And so we're definitely going to some things are going to seem real, even if they really aren't. I mean, there's going to be certain invariability, like hydrogen atoms, or it's pretty clear cut what a hydrogen atom is and is not,
Okay.
or whatever. And so, yeah, I do think that the left, or just the nominalists, the nominalist faction or whatever, that they really don't appreciate that there really are. Even if they're not ultimately real, there are conventional realities that are pretty much invariable. There may be blurry edges. You cross a dog with a wolf and you're going to have something intermediate between a dog and a wolf. You cross a French person with a Belgian, you're going to have somebody who's half French and half Belgian, so they're not going to fit Plato's, ideals very well. But still, I mean, there's categories that do have meaning and are valid at the conventional level that I think people are just trying to, with postmodernism now, it's just gone, they've just taken the ball and run with it, where there isn't, truth is just a cultural construct.
Right.
There is no such thing as objective reality and so forth. And I'd go so far as to say it's not ultimately real, but it is conventionally real. But also there's since we're on kind of this kind of tangent, or this kind of theme, a lot of scientists, even not just people who endorse scientific materialism, but a lot of scientists themselves really cannot tell the difference between like scientific method and scientific realism, where they're just assuming that science explains reality. Whereas there are other ways of interpreting science, like one way was championed by Ernst Mach. It's called instrumentalism, which says, that science is good at finding, regular patterns, but it makes no claim on metaphysical reality. All we really know is that there are regular patterns in our perceptions. If we perceive this, there's going to be the perception of that, which is a consequence of it. It's reliable. Science can determine this sort of thing, but they're not making any claims at all that science is explaining reality. That it's just, it's a matter of our perceptions. That's all we can really know is our own mind. We can't know the external universe except through the filter of our own mind. So
exactly. And what science presents is not reality, but models of reality. I think that, that's important and people who are trying to speak rigorously about it, they'll use that language. They'll talk about the model of the solar system, for example. This is something that's been refined over the centuries. At one time it was, the model had the Earth at the center and planets around the Earth, and then Tycho Brahe presented a model that had the Earth at the center, the sun goes around the Earth, and other planets go around the sun. And then Copernicus model was the sun at the center, and then Kepler model was elliptical orbits.
Yeah.
And it's not that the models are necessarily, although you could say it in a loose way, you could say they're closer to reality, but what they actually are is they fit the observations closer.
Yeah.
You can take measurements of the positions of the planets, and they fit in Kepler's model better than any of the others.
Yeah, physics especially is just mathematical equations that can be superimposed on observed phenomena, and it comes really close.
Yeah.
Like you throw a rock, it's not going to be a perfect parabola. That's the way it's supposed to work. But I mean, there's all this the air friction and wind and gravitational pulls and so forth are going to mess that up. But it's like we were saying, like atheism seems to imply in the Western world scientific realism, and scientific realism really is its own kind of religion. It's based on articles of faith. That scientific method is based on articles of faith. Like you have the article of faith that the future will behave like the present does. You just have to assume that in order for science to work. In order to make predictions, you just have to assume that the laws of physics aren't going to change. They're going to stay the same. So once you figure it out, you got it all. You've got the article of faith that like natural phenomena necessarily follow regular rules. So that in science, if you find like any kind of aberration comes up in your measurements, you just throw it out just as a matter of course.
Yeah, that's something that's been shown, that from historians of science have gone back to like the notes of famous scientists in the past and their research papers, and they have all these measurements, and they end up scoring out ones that don't plot nicely onto the curve.
Yeah,
just as common practice. And you mentioned in one of our previous discussions, you mentioned Rupert Sheldrake. One of his ideas is that the so-called physical constants are not actually constant. That something like the strength of gravity, or the I forget which other ones there are. There's a half a dozen or so like physical constants. And he looked at old measurements, and they differ from modern ones, and generally it's explained, while they didn't have as good, not by huge amounts, but small percentage points, but generally people say, well, that's because they didn't have as good measurement systems in those times, like 100 years ago. But they vary consistently, like whether a scientist is in England or California or Australia in 1910, working out from measured observation the gravitational constant, they come up with a very close value to each other that differs in the same degree from the modern calculation. So he's saying that these constants actually do vary over time, which would it sounds like kind of an arcane point, but it does throw out this whole rigid scientific realist religion that you're talking about.
Yeah. If you assume that everything is impermanent, then it seems like the laws of physics also would be impermanent.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
You could call the religion scientism, like as a religious belief system. I think it arose with the Industrial Revolution around the 1780s. So prior to that, it wasn't really a religious belief system. Like even in the West, we didn't have that scientism belief. So it could be just a temporary, strong religious belief like you're saying with physics earlier, it's already starting to fall apart since the 1950s or 60s. The scientism as an atheistic, realistic view, because like science cannot describe reality.
Right. And I think, you know, you're onto something there, Brian, that the historical development of that, I think the 19th century was the peak of scientific materialism, because the scientific model and the scientific understanding had advanced to that point where it all did seem mechanical, right, and mechanistic. And I forget who it was, one of the famous physicists or scientists of the time, towards the end of the 19th century, he advised his graduate students, don't go into a career in physics. Physics is finished. It's now just a question of working things out to a few more decimal points. We've got everything, got everything figured out. It's done.
Yeah, and Stephen Hawking was saying that in like the 1980s also. Like his book, A Brief History of Time, he's saying, you know, all we got to do at the end is just, all we have to do is just figure out a few more equations and we will know the mind of God.
Yeah.
Is,
There's no
hubris.
God.
Yeah.
Hubris.
Yeah. And the irony of that statement this physicist made was it was only a couple of years before the Michelson-Morley experiment.
Yeah, they just turned everything upside down again.
Yeah. Oh, it doesn't work. What are we going to do now? So, and with quantum mechanics, chaos theory, like the edges of science pushing into trying to understand reality is becoming more and more elusive, actually, rather than
because it's like the observer is determining what's there to some degree.
Yes.
It's no small feat to try to understand the nature of reality. That's a big job.
So this is kind of an irony that the least materialist people in the scientific world now are the physicists. You know,
Yeah.
most of biology is still very fixed on a materialist worldview.
Yeah, chemistry also, I think. And of course, things like geology, it's all just straight materialism.
Yeah.
Yeah, another article of faith of in scientism, the religion of scientism. For one, there's a number of articles of faith. One is that there's only one correct way of interpreting things, which is it's just taken as just a matter of course. You know, it's just you know, they just assume that. Another is that reality can be understood by a little blob of gray meat that's about this big. You know, that we could even possibly hope to understand reality using, according to them, just you know, electrochemical reactions in this little blob of meat.
Yeah.
But science, I mean, anything that becomes a religion starts becoming irrational. And so there's going to be people who are like fanatical scientific materialists, even after it gets outmoded and, you know, the next mainstream paradigm comes along to replace it as our understanding of how reality works.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, well, how do atheists deal with people who have like near-death experiences or evidence of little kids who recall previous lives, like Dr. Ian Stevens' work? How does an atheist, you know, relate to people who recall their previous lives with evidence?
They just dismiss it. They don't even look at it.
Yeah, so just dismiss evidence.
Yeah, or make fun of it. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, they don't seriously look at that stuff. I mean, that's like one of Rupert Sheldrake's books. He talks about this, about trying to get people criticize his views and his theories and in a kind of very dismissive way, and he tries to get them to, you know, participate in an experiment or look at the evidence, and you know, they just won't do it. It's just no. It's outside of their sphere. It's got to be wrong. It's got to be ridiculous.
I noticed that with people with UFOs, some people go through any mental gymnastics necessary to deny the existence of UFOs or aliens without looking at any evidence.
Yeah, there's a lot of that kind of thing going around, just human nature. I mean, we have to cling to a belief system. I mean, Buddhism teaches this also. I mean, it's like, you know, yeah, I mean, you have to believe something if you're unenlightened, especially, you know, you got to like cling to some interpretation of reality. And once you cling to it, I mean, it's really hard to deprogram yourself. Like someone who's been spending decades, you know, teaching something and explaining things in a certain way, they're definitely just going to fight tooth and nail, you know, irrationally at a subconscious level to avoid being proved wrong. Just because if you identify with your thoughts, I mean, if part of your beliefs get disproven, that's like part of you is being killed. You know, it's almost like a little death to be proven wrong if you're like heavily invested in your beliefs, especially. So people will just fight tooth and nail against being proven wrong, even if they have to resort to just hysterical irrationality to avoid it.
There's an idea that I think it was Karl Popper came up with it, that major paradigm shifts in science only occur when the older generation of scientists dies off.
Yeah.
I kind of talking to a friend of mine who's, you know, he's passed away now, but he was a older man, older than me, who was a professional geologist, and he went through school in the university in the 1960s, graduate school in geology, just when plate tectonics was coming in as a theory, and all his teachers and professors dismissed it as a crackpot idea.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of that. Just like what's his name? Ignat Semmelweis, who was a Hungarian doctor who worked at it'd be called a maternity ward now, a lying in hospital then. And the death rate at the lying in hospital was like 70%. I mean, women were just in tears having to go to these places. And he just found out that all you have to do is just wash your hands before you examine a patient. And the death rate went down to like 2%. And if you washed your hands with a kind of chlorine compound that he came up with, it went down to like a fraction of 1%. And the other doctors, they had their own theories, you know, it's caused by bad air or whatever. And they just, I mean, they would put disclaimers on his scientific articles. If he could get anything published, you know, the editor would say, well, this theory is generally known to be, you know, not correct, but, you know, we're publishing it anyway. And he was so frustrated. He realized all you have to do, just wash your hands. People and his own employees just resented the hell out of it. It was like they're being treated like children, being forced to wash their hands. Till finally he committed suicide. He just cracked. He couldn't stand it anymore.
Oh no, because of germs. He solved germs. And what
So all
decade
these
was
doctors
that?
just had their theories that they just, I mean, they just adhered to these fiercely.
So when
it was just
that?
the younger doctors, the younger generation of doctors that came along, started reading his articles and trying it out, and turned out to be correct. And then Baron Lister came along and proved the idea of, you know, sepsis and the effects of antisepsis.
So is that like early 20th century?
Yeah, that was early 20th century.
So I remember when President McKinley was shot in 1901, the surgeon, they stuck his finger up the hole, you know, to feel the bullet. They didn't consider germs at all. And then he got infected and died.
Yeah.
You remind me of I think of the one sutta of the Buddha called one fortunate attachment. Like you're saying, you need to attach to a view if you're unenlightened. So the Buddha advocated you should attach to right view. You should attach to his view.
Yeah, I mean, if you're good, you have to be attached to some kind of view, you know, if you're a worldly, you know, if you're unenlightened. But it's good to have something that's flexible and as broad-minded as possible, and be open to new ideas. Even if you think you found the truth, you know, never completely shut the door, you know, just, you know, keep looking just in case, I suppose.
There's a parable in the Digha Nikaya about the two men who were traveling, and they come across an abandoned village. And the Buddha particularly identifies this as a parable about view, attachment to the views. They're going through the village and they see some firewood sticks, and they make bundles and put it on their head and carry on. And then a little bit later they come across some cloth, and the one guy says, oh, cloth, that's more valuable than firewood sticks. And he throws his bundle away and puts the firewood sticks on his head. The other guy says, I've carried these sticks a long ways and it's kind of a waste to not keep them now. Oh, okay, suit yourself. And they keep finding more and more valuable things until the one guy comes back to the village with a bag of jewels and precious
Yeah.
thick for life, and the other guy comes back with firewood sticks because it's been, the further he carries it, the more attached he is to it. He can't give it up. And the
Yeah.
Buddha recognizes that through views. A subtle point in that sutta that could be missed is that the Buddha doesn't praise someone who comes back to the village with an empty head, not carrying anything, but the one who is flexible in his views. When he sees something better, he throws it away and adopts the new one. Because you do need to have a view, as you say, like to orient yourself in the world. You have to have some kind of working hypothesis about how things are. But you need to be ready to change that or modify it.
Yeah, one of the stereotypical examples of a fool in the Pali text is someone who says only this is true, anything else is wrong.
Right, yes.
So it is good to be open-minded. And I had somebody ask me a question recently about right view, how it's the first step in the Noble Eightfold Path. And he's saying, well, I mean, that should be like the last step. It's like, how do you start off with right view? And I was just explaining, I mean, it's the right view for a beginner is relatively simplistic, just you're believing Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path and, karma, that sort of thing, actions have consequences. And then, as you meditate and progress, you cultivate your mind, get into more subtle states of consciousness, your right view is going to like evolve over time.
Mm.
And that's good. I mean, science is supposed to be that way too. It's supposed to evolve over time, but it's human nature being such as it is. It's like an uphill fight a lot of the time.
Yeah, and when you hear the phrase "the science is subtle," you know that somebody doesn't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Also think about how
for more than a
politicized,
week or two.
thinking like science is very politicized today. It's kind of another topic. Like, can you really trust scientists who are bought off by governments or corporations to espouse a particular view, which is not true?
Well,
Yeah, just pressure.
Yeah, I think there's different kinds of pressure too. There's peer pressure. It takes a bit of courage to be the kind of the maverick in the group that's bucking everybody else. And there's also like professional or in academia that you need to kind of please the powers that be if you're going to get ahead in your career, right? So I think you see a lot of that in it's a corrupting influence on the actual what science should be doing, which is trying to get closer to a model that reflects the reality.
Yeah, the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all being politicized. Even Dhamma is politicized to some degree, which is unfortunate, but that's the way it is.
So anything else on atheism and Buddhism?
No.
I guess we've solved all the problems of the universe, so
Yeah.
I guess we can wrap it up. So thank you kindly, Ajahn and pannobhasa.